On August 8th, Reuters reported that a gallery in Bangkok is pressured by China to remove and redact artwork about Beijing's treatment of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers from an exhibit on authoritarian governments. And in February, the United States condemned Thailand for deporting 40 ethnic Uyghurs to China, warning that the men risk facing torture when they return to the northeastern region of Xinjiang, which they fled more than 10 years ago. It is an open secret that Uyghurs living in China have been subjected to widespread human rights abuses, including detention in massive concentration camps. While the camps were the products of Xi Jinping's regime, the abuses the Uyghurs face in their own homes have been going on for decades. You're listening to The Divide. My name is Ira Xu. Today's episode is very different. It is a testimony by someone who has lived through those abuses.
My name is Zumretay Arkin. I am an Uyghur activist and the vice president of the World Uyghur Congress.
Zumretay has been campaigning for Uyghurs' rights for years, and recently, the World Uyghur Congress released a statement commemorating the 16th anniversary of the Urumqi Massacre, which Zumretay witnessed firsthand.
I was quite young at the time, but it was also my first time visiting my homeland after I had immigrated to Canada at a young age. And it was, I think, for me, a very eye-opening experience. So the Urumqi Massacre basically started because of lack of accountability for the murders of Uyghurs who happened in Shaoguan factory. And that was on June 26th in 2009. And then a few Uyghurs were killed by Chinese workers. Neither the government nor the company addressed this. The death of Uyghurs and the loss of lives.
The factory incident, also known as the Shaoguan incident, happened on June 25, 2009, where a false accusation of rape of a Han woman by Uyghur men led to a brawl between ethnic Han and Uyghur factory workers in Shaoguan City. Groups of Han Chinese set upon Uyghur co-workers, leading to at least 2 Uyghurs being violently killed by angry Han Chinese men, and some 118 people injured. Other reports actually indicate a higher death toll.
So there was no reparation, there was no justice, there was no accountability. So because of that, that was just an illustration or a very, single incident, but that was very representative of the discrimination that Uyghurs were facing in their daily lives, whether it's at school, university, or in workspaces, or in even just public spaces. Uyghurs were critically increasingly discriminated and isolated from accessing also different spheres, whether it's workplace or elsewhere. So Uyghurs in Urumqi, mostly it started from like a students' movement. So university students took the streets of Urumqi, the capital, to demand justice for the loss of lives of these innocent Uyghurs and reparation for their families. And then that just became a broader movement, basically, and it was just a call to action to address some of the inequalities, discrimination that was happening in the Uyghur society. And immediately the government replied with sending the army, sending soldiers, and there was a huge crackdown on Uyghur protesters. As you know, freedom of expression or freedom of assembly is not tolerated in China, and especially not in our region where such rights are not exercised, and when they are, then they're met with brutal crackdown. So that's exactly what happened. And over a week, so the protest started on July 5th, where the heavy crackdown on student protesters happened. So there was a lot of arbitrary detention, extrajudicial disappearances, as well as killings. And then the next day, it was others protesting. And then on July 7th, it was the mothers, the daughters, the women who took the streets to protest for their missing loved ones. Because, as I said, it was mostly students, mostly male students who started this. It became this kind of protest or confrontation between the mothers and the women and against the soldiers. And it just, it quickly escalated, and then the government shut down internet communication. So we arrived on I believe July 7th. There was already a shutdown, internet shutdown, so we couldn't really access or speak to our family, some of my family members back in Canada, to let them know we had arrived safely, and no phone communication. So it was very difficult. But for me, from my perspective, the way I saw it was we arrived in Beijing airport, where we face increased scrutiny and increased racial profiling. Although we were Canadian citizens at the time, because our birthplace was Urumqi, we were discriminated. My mom was taken to an interrogation room. She was interrogated for over 40 minutes because we had only bought the tickets until Beijing, and we would buy our tickets to Urumqi from Beijing, which is quite convenient, but we were denied this. Instead, some Chinese people were offered those tickets. So in some ways, we managed to get the tickets at the end. We arrived in Urumqi one day later, and it was the middle of the night. The international airport of Urumqi was completely shut down. There was no visitors allowed. There was just completely shut down. There was no electricity either. So when we landed, we were told that there was only one small van for all the people. There was no taxis allowed, no families, friends allowed, nothing allowed. When we tried to go on that van, the chauffeur was a Han Chinese. And when he saw we were two Uyghur families, he immediately refused us to board. And then my mom, because she speaks fluent Chinese, she managed to get him to take us with some money. And he dropped us off at the entrance of our neighborhood where my family was waiting. And immediately when we got off the bus, we ran into the apartment where my grandma, we were basically visiting my sick grandma at the time. And that's how it happened. And then we basically were isolated quarantined for 3 weeks in the apartment. We didn't leave really because there was increased security everywhere. There was soldiers stationed at every neighborhood entrance, and there was extra scrutiny on visitors who were, especially Uyghur visitors coming from elsewhere. And after 3 weeks, we managed to, there were some things that were loosened, and we managed to leave the neighborhood. But I saw there was so much anxiety in the air, so much fear, and I saw some Uyghurs get arrested in the streets just for, being Uyghur. For me, that was just eye-opening, the way that we were treated as second-class citizens in our own homeland. The systematic discrimination was ongoing and just increasing in a way, because I grew up there, and I saw, the previous picture, and to me that felt very different, and that felt like we were being dominated by the Chinese. There was not only domination, but also this hatred towards Uyghurs.
Bloody crackdown for peaceful protests has always been in the Chinese Communist Party's playbook. I asked Zumretay if she knows the casualties of this incident.
The official numbers, they're very small, of course. There's no, as you can imagine, there's no transparency around any of these protests or massacres, especially the Urumqi Massacre. But at the time, still there was some access to foreign media, because I remember seeing some of that by the foreign media, especially in Canada when I was there. But I think we estimated around over 2,000. I believe our official numbers were around 3,000, if I'm not mistaken. I'll just have to check, but the government's casualties were a couple hundred. So it's nothing that was, that met the actual gravity of the situation. And it's the same with any other massacres. Just yesterday, we commemorated the 11th anniversary of the Arkin massacre from 2014, and that was also, the casualties were 96 by the government. And for us, we estimated at over 3,000. So there's always a lot of gap between the statistics given by the international community or the international Uyghur organizations, as opposed to what the Chinese government is really saying.
Official Chinese sources said that 197 people were killed and more than 1,700 injured. Many human rights advocates found that these numbers are underestimated and obscure the full extent of violence perpetrated against Uyghurs. And what's even more nonsensical is that the Chinese government claimed that the riots, how it always categorizes peaceful protest, were planned from abroad by the World Uyghur Congress. Now, Zumretay mentioned something also happened in 2014. That was the year I recall Uyghur economist Ilham Tohti was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment on separatist charges.
If I'm not mistaken, Ilham Tohti was arrested on January 2014. And then the Arkin massacre was, of course, in the summer. But the Arkin massacre started because of Ramadan restrictions. Because at the time, yes, Ilham Tohti was arrested. That was one big case. But there was also a lot, because Ilham Tohti was arrested in his Beijing house and then transferred to Urumqi in prison. But in East Turkestan, there was still a lot happening in that year because the government was starting, it was also around the time when Xi Jinping took power, and there was a lot of things that was changing, not only in our region, but also in mainland China. And specifically after Xi Jinping visited the region, he said that he was shocked by the lack of assimilation, I suppose, because he realized that Uyghurs were not as assimilated as he had imagined. They were fluently speaking their language, and everything was going in their own ways, and in a way like they had autonomy on a lot of things. But then Xi Jinping visited and he said, we need to change this. We need to change radical mindsets. We need to change the way these people are living. We need to promote Han-centric identities. And to do that, he had to introduce several legislation, including, counterterrorism laws, regulation on the extremification, all of these things that came to specifically restrict freedom of religion in the beginning. So there were Ramadan restrictions. People could not really fast anymore, specifically children or 18, if you were 18 and if you're not 18 and above, you couldn't fast. So students couldn't fast in schools. Women could not wear modest clothing or wear veils anymore. These kind of restrictions that really suffocated the Uyghurs. And then that started at the time, the Arkin massacre. And then the massacre really started when one Uyghur family of 5 were killed by the Chinese police during a house search. And then people took the streets to protest, and then the protest was also brutally met with crackdown. That's how it happened. But yes, it was kind of at the time when Xi Jinping was starting to really reimagine the region and to implement some of the drastic measures to synthesize Uyghurs, but also assimilate and eradicate Uyghurs.
Erasing a community's culture, its religion, its beliefs has always been front and center of the Chinese Communist Party's ruling. And to justify their criminal behavior, they labeled minorities as terrorists, separatists, and interned them in camps.
So the camps, when it started, so people started disappearing overnight. They would disappear, they would not come back. There were a couple of different groups of people who were targeted at first. You had the intellectuals. You can say that the kind of the influential figures of the Uyghur society were the first target. Then came, of course, the religious figures, because they're also part of the influential people in a society. But then, of course, over the years, it kind of became widespread, and anyone who was Uyghur was becoming a target for the government. So you had different criteria as well for this. For example, if you attended mosque prayers, if you went on pilgrimage, if you went to Muslim majority countries, if you were wearing a veil, hijab, that became a suspicious reason as well. It was also, for example, if you gave your child, your newborn, Islamic names, that was also suspicious activity that was considered as a terrorist or extremist Act. So that was all of these acts were legislated. So it was in the counterterrorism law, but also in the regulation on the extremification that were introduced in those years. Basically, what these laws, two pieces of legislation did was to criminalize Islamic identity. So anything that was related to Islam, practice of Islam, was becoming a criminal activity. So you had all of these people who, could be doing any of these very normal behaviors, practice Islam, pray, fast during Ramadan, all of a sudden were targeted because of that. But you also had people who were, for example, the intellectuals who were not usually that religious. They were quite, secular. They were promoting secularism, but also they were quite open-minded and liberal thinking, but they were also they were specifically proning ideas about history and different things. And I think for the government, it became a threat. So for them, they would just intern these people. If you look at all of these leaked documents, you also see, for example, from the Karakash list, the Aksu list, the Xinjiang papers that came out in 2019, you see how the government is basically trying to eradicate every single behavior of Uyghurs. So whether it's in public spaces or in private spaces, the government didn't leave any space for anyone, for any Uyghur to think, to practice, to act, nothing. So they just started disappearing en masse, millions of people. And of course, to the last part of your question, where are we now? It's a difficult question to answer to, because there's absolutely no access to information right now. The government has, of course, over the last years, we've received so many leaked documents, we've received so many testimonies from camp survivors, but the government is, at the moment, you probably saw that there was a new also party secretary to the region. There's this attempt since 3 years to rebuild the image of Xinjiang, to portray it as a place of harmony, of ethnic harmony, of unity, of prosperity, development, to the international community. And it's worked to some extent, especially in the global south, but that's why the government is only releasing some parts of the information. But regarding the camps still exist, the network still exists. However, some of these camps have been repurposed into, for example, training centers, vocational centers where people go to study and, in a way, eradicate their radical mindset. That's how the government basically frames it. And those camps still exist. There are a lot of detention camps still. Another thing that we've documented over the years is the increase in terms of prison rates. So we might not hear about the camps and extrajudicial or arbitrary detention as much as before. However, if you look at the prison rates over the years between specifically 2020, I think after 2020, the prison rates have increased. Especially if you look at the sentences, they're all related to terrorism-related charges. So, for having committed the crimes, the so-called crimes that I've described before, it indicates that perhaps the government is changing gears and they're just trying to put people into the judicial system instead of the extrajudicial system, which was widely condemned by the international community.
While the camps have been repurposed, here's a reality check by Peter Irwin of the Uyghur Human Rights Project.
So what we know from the limited amount of information we're able to get is that, yes, the numbers of people in these camps, re-education camps is what some call them, internment camps is the language we've used. Concentration camps is what others have used. Certainly the number of people in these facilities has decreased. But what's happened, and at the same time, there's been this parallel expansion of prisons. So myself and a colleague actually did some research on prison numbers, and we tried to estimate the number of people in prison. And it's a gargantuan number. It's something like 500,000 people are in prison. A massive prison population. It's actually, if you compare the prison rate to other countries, it's the highest prison rate in the world by far. Higher than Russia, higher than the United States, higher than the rest of China, certainly.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Divide. This episode is brought to you by Radio Taiwan International.